Okay, we'll get started on the discussion on is cheating ruining sport. I'm chairing it. I'm Jeff Kidder, Director of Membership and Events at the Institute of Ideas. In this panel discussion, there won't be any formal introduction, so what I will do is introduce the panellists to you, ask some questions, and we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up for audience questions and points. So going from my left to the right, we have Dr. Emily Ryle, who's Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at the University of Gloucestershire and Chair of the British Philosophy of Sport Association, who's currently writing an introductory book on the philosophy of sport due to be published next year. We have Dulip Alaraja, who's sports columnist for Spite and who co-founded Libero Network, which campaigned against the increasing regulation of football fan conduct. He's a season ticket holder at Crystal Palace and is well known for his views on the sanitisation of football. On my right we have Professor Sir Simon Wesley, who's Vice Dean for Academic Psychiatry and Chair and Head of the Department of Psychological Medicine at the Institute of Psychiatry, and is speaking here in his capacity for those qualities and also for being a season ticket holder at Chelsea. And finally, on my far right, we have Tom Watt, who's an actor, writer and broadcaster, best known in those categories as Lockie from EastEnders, David Beckham's ghostwriter, Fighting Talk Champion of Champions, and directing FC Cabal, A Journey with Tony Adams. So here we have our panel. I think you'd like to give them a quick round of applause. And I'll just start off by asking a general question to the panel and we'll start a discussion. I don't know if people will agree, disagree. We'll find out over the next 60 minutes. So to start off, do people think that cheating is ruining sport? Lance Armstrong, all the recent discussions around cheating in many different sports, or is it something that's always been with us? Simon, do you want to kick us off?
Actually, until this morning, I thought the panel was Does Chelsea Ruin Sport? I've only just read it again and realised that wasn't the panel, so I feel deeply embarrassed on that, because I was prepared to be very passionate on that subject. I mean, yes, of course, it's an absolute terrible, horrible thing, and the most famous scandal in sport probably was the 1919 White Sox baseball scandal, in which it turned out America's most favourite sports people had all joined together, taken a huge bribe and thrown the World Series. As a result of that, baseball collapsed as a sport, and indeed there were several books written about it, all called America's Loss of Innocence. So it wasn't just the end of the sport, it was actually the whole end of the integrity of the American nation. Well, except that's all bollocks, isn't it? Because that isn't what happened at all. It was a terrible scandal, but baseball now, 54% of Americans say that it's their favourite sport, and the number of books written on America's Loss of Innocence has now reached several hundred. Genuinely, if you put in America Loss of Innocence into books, you get about 100 titles, ranging from that scandal right through to Watergate, 9/11, Vietnam, the whole of the 60s, and the invention of cinema, which seems rather weird, but there is a book called The Invention of Cinema, Loss of Innocence. Didn't do very well. So, no, it hasn't. But I think what we're talking about is two types of cheating. There's a type of cheating in which we are all complicit. So every time I go to a football game, there is cheating there. And to be absolutely honest with you, that's part of the reason why we go. We're in on it, we like it, we don't like it, we boo, we hiss. It's part, and in sports where it's very difficult to cheat, like chess or rowing, are frankly bloody boring. That's why nobody goes to watch, because you can't cheat. But then there's the cheating which we're not in on it. We're not part of it. We don't know about it, which of course we're now talking about drugs and cycling, where we can't ourselves participate because we don't really have a view, because we don't know it's happening. And I think there are two rather different. There's the fun, your wee rascal type cheating, and then there's the Lance Armstrong, you bloody bastard, your psychotic, psychopathic criminal type cheating. So I think those are the two types of cheating. One, I think, adds to the gaiety of nations. The other, I think, is more problematic.
Okay. Emily?
Is cheating ruining sport? It might be getting worse as sport becomes more and more professionalised, because there's a difference between the instrumental goods of sport and the intrinsic goods of sport. And most people start playing sport for the intrinsic goods, such as fun, enjoyment, the social side of it, and simply because they just love playing it. As those young athletes progress and perhaps end up in the professional sphere where they start to earn their living from it, And it depends as to whether they get selected or not, it depends whether they win a particular match or not, then the demands to cheat probably become more intense because the intrinsic goods of sport no longer matter so much because they wish to ensure that they earn a living at the end of the day. So I think it is cheating ruining sports. The cheating has always been around ever since the Olympic times. There's always been cheating. You may know that they used to, cheaters that found in Olympia used to have to pay to put up statues of themselves as recompense to the god Zeus. And you'll see the plinths there if you go to Olympia. And it had their name on it as the cheat, and it had their parents' names, and it had where they came from. So you can imagine the shame. So cheating is not a new phenomenon in sports. It's always been about, but I think perhaps as sport becomes more and more professionalised, there are greater, I suppose, demands or greater incentives for sports people and athletes to cheat, because the different types, because they're doing sport for a different reason, not simply because the pure enjoyment of it, but rather to earn a living at the end of the day.
Okay, Tom?
Emily's kind of nailed it really. I think is cheating ruining sport? Actually, the obvious answer is if it was going to ruin sport, it would have done so by now. Because it has, you mentioned Lance Armstrong. The very first race, Tour de France. The fellas, the lot of them have come over the line absolutely charged on champagne and coffee, which were performance-enhancing substances. A little bit unsophisticated, but they were nonetheless performance-enhancing substances. But I would just like to, just my kind of personal experience, the kind of greatest, I use that in inverted commas, the greatest piece of cheating that I've ever witnessed was, I was lucky enough to be at Soccer City for the quarter-final of the 2010 World Cup between Ghana and Uruguay. And it was an astonishing tournament, not that you would have realised following from over here, I suspect, but it was the most astonishing tournament, and that game was without question the most emotional, most significant and most inspiring on all sorts of levels game of the tournament. The fact that not only had the whole of South Africa, kind of Rugby World Cup style, got behind the South African national team, but once they were dumped down, the fact that a whole continent got behind Ghana that night at Soccer City, it was an incredibly charged atmosphere in the stadium, and as I'm sure you remember, with the score 1-1 with a couple of minutes of injury, extra time remaining, a goal-bound header was punched off the line by Suarez. Oh yeah, him again. Punched off the line by Suarez. Suarez was red-carded, therefore missed the semi-final down at Cape Town a few days later against Holland, but he missed the semi-final. Unfortunately, AU missed the penalty, and the game finished, the resulting penalty, and the game finished 1-1. Uruguay won on penalties and went through to the semi-finals, and it was an astonishing night, really, on all sorts of levels. And there you have a man, didn't just come and cheat an opposing team, didn't even cheat a stadium full or the people. Here's a man, Suarez, who in that moment cheated an entire continent. It would have been the first time, there just would have been such poetry to the idea of an African nation reaching the semi-finals of the World Cup for the first time in the first World Cup ever to be held on that continent. It just would have been an astonishing thing. And Luis Suarez cheating denied the tournament and the continent of Africa that. However, I was sat right behind the goal, and in that moment you think, well, that's what I would have done. Because it was, and to be fair, Suarez described it afterwards as instinctive. He then went on to describe it as, the new hand of God and whatever you might. But it was, and it was just one of those, that was the most spectacular example of cheating I've ever seen. And yet, who wouldn't have? And so you kind of think, well, maybe cheating, there's no danger of it ruining sport because it's an absolutely key element of sport. And that night kind of proved that absolutely, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, thanks.
Is cheating ruining sport? No. Thank you. I could end on no, but I actually think it's worth asking why are we asking this question, because, as Tom says, you know, we've had cheating since sports rules were codified, and it hasn't led to the collapse of sport. And you can see the sort of narrative, which is that you've got to have the rules, you've got to have integrity. You know, there's got to be a level playing field. There's got to be a certain spirit to the game. Otherwise, the game is rendered meaningless in the eyes of competitors and spectators. And yet people break the rules, and you know, and sometimes in small ways with gamesmanship, sometimes in very big ways like Lance Armstrong or match rigging, you know, taking bombs, taking money to dive if you're a boxer and so on. But if it was to ruin sport, you would expect those sports to have collapsed. You would expect the public to become disaffected. And that simply hasn't happened with most professional sports. And actually, if you look at WWE wrestling, which is the most rigged sport in the whole world, but it's incredibly popular. People seem not to mind that it's rigged. So, you know, there's an element of sport which is that it's a sort of drama, it's a pantomime, and therefore it needs cheats. And I think that and there are rules to punish cheats, you know, so if you break the rules like Suarez, you get sent off. He would have been suspended for the semi-final. He was suspended for the semi-final. That's in that potentially the biggest match of his life. He's suspended from that. You could argue whether that's proportionate or not for cheating a continent from you know, their first.
I don't think the death sentence was available.
But so you can argue whether the punishment is proportionate, and we will argue about that. But if you break the rules of sport, you're usually punished. You know, if you're guilty of match rigging like Juventus were, they were relegated and they lost 2 Serie A titles. So sport has its own rules. It has its own self-policing. What I think the discussion about cheating in sport signifies is that and there has been this view since Victorian times, that sport is an instrument of moral education, that sport teaches people values, that what you learn on the playing fields you play out in the rest of society. And I don't think we've shed that idea. I don't think we've shed the idea that sport is fundamentally not only just a game, it's about teaching us the right values, sportsmanship, fair play and so on. And you see that reflected in the current discussion about footballers or other sports people being role models. You know, we still seem to believe that sport is a moral instrument. And I think that's why there's so much preoccupation with cheating in sport. Not, obviously if you play sport it's wrong, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole of Western civilization unravels as a result. And I think that's where we should focus the debate. Why is it, I mean, do we need to get that worried about cheating in sport? I don't think so.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've already, you've already raised the issue that there's something more of a moral case, kind of, you know, we're getting into the business of role models, etc., etc. But mention of your, presumably it's your mate Beckham, yeah, presumably is he? Anyway, you wrote his book.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, you know, his most famous moment was the 2002 World Cup qualifier, and you remember he takes the free kick and he gets us into the World Cup. Now, he didn't cheat at all. However, someone did. Teddy Sheringham dived to get that free kick, which then took us into the World Cup. But that wasn't the issue at all. The issue was what was then said later, and I'm sure that, well, I don't know if you do remember, but I remember it very well, was the commentator, Motson, then was watching, and they show the replay, and he says, oh gosh, Konstantinidis, I think, has got a case there. But who's arguing if you're English? Now, at that point, you know, any possibility of a kind of moral case here, or a Corinthian case, disappears. It's perfectly okay, he tells the entire world to dive to get us into the World Cup because we're English.
No, I think that is a very good point, and I think, particularly in football, but generally speaking, I think, you know, cheating has often been a kind of a stick that xenophobes can use to beat, you know, foreign interlopers, and it's been traditionally something that supposedly sets us apart from the others, which obviously, you know, moments like that, and you can look at the actually the tournament before that in 1998. Michael Owen goes through and, you know, very early as a 17-year-old and takes a tumble against Argentina, and, you know. But that's almost by the by. I think what Dilip was talking about, this whole sort of thing of sport as a moral instrument, I think is absolutely is fascinating, really, because I think it's one of those things where we all kind of get on with our lives. The idea of sport teaching us, I think it's kind of it's strange how that works, because I think actually sport is like all the best drama. What sport does is actually hold up a mirror to us. It's not like we can be better people as sports people. You know, sport will reflect how we are. It's just that in sport, we kind of see it very starkly. We see a very, very, very clear reflection of ourselves and where we are morally, ethically, aesthetically sometimes. And it's amazing that I think why we get so up on our high horse about cheating is that we look at that reflection and we actually don't like what we see. In all other spheres of life, we live with it from day to day, week to week, without there being any crisis. But then when sport shows us kind of what we are, we get very, very upset when we don't like what we see. And I think that's maybe what do you know what I mean? It's perhaps the idea of sport teaching us entirely. There may be some of that. But definitely it does kind of reflect us, and I think that we get so obsessed with the idea of cheating in sport because when we see cheating in sport, we kind of take cheating in life on the chin, surrounded by it every day. We do it in small ways every single day, every single one of us. But when we see it on the pitch or on the track, it really, really offends and hurts us.
Yeah, I think Tom's absolutely right in saying that sport is a mirror, but it kind of clarifies and exaggerates something about our personalities. And I think the odd thing about sport is that it's the rules of sport are completely arbitrary. There's no practical reason why you should not be able to pick up a football on a piece of grass turf, but it defines the game of football. So, and I think that's why it exaggerates and emphasises some of the perhaps the characteristics or the values that we have about rule following. But on the other hand, to say that whilst cheating is just a necessary part of sport, I don't think it is. I mean, there's an argument that suggests that cheaters are not even playing the game. Whatever, you know, if they cheat in football, they're not playing the game of football because they're not abiding by the rules of football. And you can imagine if everybody cheated in a sport, then the sport would just descend into anarchy and it wouldn't be able to continue to exist. So
Tour de France functions.
Does it? But they're playing a different. I suppose they're playing a different sport to the one that most of the public believe they're playing. So they're playing a kind of open game that accepts particular substances that the public or the media perhaps don't accept. So they're playing a slightly different game. Now, there are obviously a few individuals in the Tour de France that haven't succeeded, haven't done very well, and have said, I'm not going to participate in that game that you're playing. But sport essentially depends on people playing the game in good faith and abiding by the rules and not cheating. Because if everybody cheated, then the game just couldn't carry on existing. Now, the Tour de France, I think, is an interesting example because obviously those riders and those around them, the coaches and the team around them, have decided, implicitly or explicitly, that they're going to change the rules slightly to enable a different game to be played. But it does depend on, you know, I guess if one of the Tour de France riders decided to put a secret motor on his bike, then everybody else would be up in arms. You know, all the other riders would say, no, that's not part of the game of Tour de France. So it does depend on people playing the game in good faith.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying, cheating's part of the game and we should just let people get on with it. Cheating, what I'm saying is cheating's part of the game, and so is fighting against cheating, and battling against cheating, and wanting more, and wanting better, and I think that's a great function of sport, is that we see this reflection and we're appalled, you know, in a way that we're not, and we actually start thinking about the rights and wrongs and what we're happy about and what we'll accept or otherwise. I mean, and you know, it gives you the story. It gives you drama, I mean, in the real sense of the word. Lance Armstrong being the perfect case in point, you know. The best will in the world, if the guy's cycling clean, that's an unbelievable story. You know, with the cancer and everything, it's an unbelievable story. The fact that he was doing it actually takes the story to a different level. It takes it genuinely, and I'm not using the kind of tabloid version of the word, I mean genuinely takes it into the realm of tragedy. Here is, you know, someone whose unbelievable hubris was able to convince himself, that although everything he did was wrong, he convinced himself that it was right. And that's tragedy, that's real tragedy. It's an extraordinary story. And in a way more extraordinary than it would have been if he'd just been this kind of hero that he was for millions. Do you know what I mean? So I do think cheating's part of it, but then fighting against the cheating is part of it as well. And you know, it's,
You want to say anything on Lance Armstrong?
Well, I mean, it's a question of whether or not. I mean, there's two things about that story. First is, as you said, first of all, he started out as a kind of as a moral paradigm because his story was about beating cancer, and then he became a kind of a sporting beauty because there was no doubt about it. He was the best cyclist in the world, and he would have won if they'd all not been taking drugs, and he would have won when they all were taking drugs. I mean, when he was
that's
dominant,
his argument.
well, I don't think there's much doubt about that. I mean, had you know the cleanest rider when he was running would have come in at 90th. 80% of them were on drugs, and he was still. And there was something about him that was utterly dominant, whether on or off. But then it's a question: was there sporting beauty? And I've seen some of the Tour de France stages, and you can see them now. Some of the things he did were amazing. Was it then ruined by his ethical vice? And I don't quite know whether it was or wasn't. I think it's much more morally ambiguous because of the way it also prevented those, as you just said, who didn't want to play that game that way, simply couldn't play the game. They were not going to be in it. They were either forced out by Armstrong or they could have stayed in, but they were not going to win. That was fairly obvious. And that puts you into a very difficult kind of moral plane. And he was an ethically compromised person at that point. But does that detract from the beauty of watching what he did? Which I'm ambiguous about, to be honest. I think you get into very clear-cut things when you're talking about the kind of Eastern European kids who were in the 60s who were put onto drugs in order to become sporting legends, who clearly had no choice in the matter, and that's indefensible. There's nothing you can say about that.
But that's what Lance Armstrong was doing. He was running his own little Eastern European state.
Yes, but he was running it among people who all knew the rules themselves and had signed up, to that particular convention of the time they had.
Any other comments from the panel on this or anything else? And then we'll get some questions from the audience.
Just on Lance Armstrong, I mean that's probably the only place where you can see the kind of apparent correlation between doping scandals and public disaffection, because the sort of survey evidence shows that people in France have been becoming less and less interested in the Tour de France.
Yeah, that's because I haven't had a French one.
Well, exactly, since Bernardino in 1985. But I think it's also because French society is changing. So I think you can look at, and there have been scandals before which have never, like Festina in 98, which didn't lead to a sudden kind of collapse of popularity. I think French society is changing. Young people are just, they don't, I've written about some spike this week, they don't drink wine as much as their grandparents, they watch more football, they're interested in other stuff.
What's happening to them?
They eat fast food, for God's sake, sacre bleu.
I mean,
and they don't like the Tour de France.
There is at least one other incident that kind of springs to mind that is at least as significant and perhaps as, if anything, has maybe undermined the sport it happened in even more than, because I think we all celebrated what Bradley Wiggins got up to and kind of assume he's clean and happy days. So we've kind of got over that. You think about the impact of Ben Johnson winning gold at what was it, Seoul Olympics? Seoul Olympics. So Ben Johnson charges across the line and fails the dope test, and and subsequently of those 8 finalists, 7 subsequently tested positive. And you've got an absolutely outstanding, one of the great athletes of mine or any other lifetime in Usain Bolt, and yet there's the thought, every time he crosses the line, not least because there have been doping scandals in Jamaican sport recently, but every time he crosses the line there's that, I wonder if I wonder if. And that, you know, if cheating's going to ruin sport, that's the way in which it ruins it. Is that it just gives you that.
Yeah.
I wonder if that you doubt the evidence of your own eyes, and that's, you know, that.
But I mean, the logic. But it would have ruined athletics, and if you saw with the Olympics last year, it might have knocked it for a while. But it's
absolutely
springing back, and actually, then the story becomes about the clean hero versus the doping. You know, and it doesn't necessarily destroy the sport. It just kind of changes our perceptions of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions? Again, did you think it is a real problem? Well, first of all, people think it is a real problem. Is there somebody's got a microphone? Yeah, so you just take the guy in front and then the bit behind will go, yeah, make a few points and then we come back to the panel.
Right, so something that I feel has been quite missing from this discussion is the athlete's point of view. And we're also looking in on it as a spectator. Actually, I've been involved with high-level sport for quite a number of years, whether it be from national level all the way through to GB trials for rowing in 2012.
I apologise.
But there's two sides to it from the athlete's point of view. Now, as it turns out, I didn't get selected to represent my country, but that's because I wasn't good enough, and I accept that. And I admire and respect the people who did get selected as my peers, and I'm friends with them. But the problem comes when there are cheats even in rowing. In 2006, the Russian women's squad tested positive for drug doping and was disqualified. And subsequently, the GB crew got promoted into the gold medal position. But that doesn't take away the fact that the Russians still crossed the line first and took all the glory at the time. And I know the member of the group quite well. They still feel quite strongly about that, and it doesn't give them back the thing that they feel they should have had. On the other side of things, cheating doesn't have to ruin sport. I became an engineer after I finished my full-time athletics career, although it was quite short. 16 to 22 wasn't a long time. But in Formula One, its technological development is often seen as cheating. But then ultimately it just changes the rules 2 weeks down the line, so then it's not cheating anymore. But when everyone's doing it, it doesn't necessarily ascend into chaos, it just develops the sport and changes the rules. So I think we can survive in both aspects, but the thing we really must challenge is the fact that we can't give back those moments to the people that should probably happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, the person behind you, yeah, spots behind you.
Thank you. I'm interested in your opinions on the grey area of diving in football, because I'm sure most of us support blatant diving when there's no contact. But what about when there's slight contact and the player goes down to win a penalty, claiming he's got the contact he needs and goes down? Because it seems to be more accepted now. You see Gareth Bale in interviews saying there was contact, I had a right to go down, and even pundits in Match of the Day, they'll say he has a right to go down, there's contact there. So I'm interested in your opinions about that.
Okay, a couple more. Yeah, guy just behind. We'll go around the room, take a few, and then come back to panel.
Okay, just building on the last 2 points that came up, from a participation point of view, from the athlete's point of view, I'd like to challenge the panel. We all kind of came to a consensus that there was cheating that we're in on, and cheating that we're not in on, the drug taking, and so distinguishing the drug taking from the diving, to use 2 popular ones. Would you not say, from the athlete's point of view, from the participation point of view, that the cheating that we're in on, the diving, the gamesmanship and things like that, just as much ruins sport as things like doping and cheating? It cheats them out of results and out of success in the same way. So is it not a bit selfish, just as spectators, to be okay with that kind of cheating from a dramatic and theatrical point of view?
Okay, and the guy behind, just there. Yeah, you. Yeah. Well.
Just like ask the panel's opinion on why it seems to be more accepted in some sports and not others, and where do you think that came from? With football and the diving, I get annoyed if anyone dives and it costs Celtic a goal. Well, if a Celtic player does it and we get a penalty, I'm really happy about it. I'm not complaining. But you get sports like, I know there's been recent match fixing in snooker, there's been some scandals. But I remember going back 10, 15 years ago, sort of a couple of players whose shirts had sort of brushed one of the balls, and the cameras and the referee hadn't picked up, and they would hold their hand up. And one player, it cost him a tournament, and he admitted that. So in that sport, it just wasn't at that time seen as a done thing. And I also tend to agree with the fact that if people are in on it, does it matter? Like over the years, I've owned a number of racing greyhounds, and somebody asked us who my dogs were with, and I told them the trainer's name, which for obvious reasons I won't repeat here. And they said, "Oh, he's crooked him." I says, "I know." I says, "We pay extra for that." We moved them from the other trainer because he would invent them. So we were quite happy for that. But again, within that sport, we sort of knew it was happening. And I knew that if money came for dogs owned by people I knew, that there was a fair good chance those dogs were going to win.
Okay, I get I'll take more points in a minute. I get the panel to come back on any of those points. I want particularly the very well-made point at the front about, even if you don't like the rules as they are, people feel or are cheated out of an experience of a lifetime or whatever. It was quite a powerfully made point. Anyway, any of the points being made, I want to come back on Emily.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, I mean, I don't condone cheating at all. I would certainly not welcome or encourage anybody to cheat in sport, because I think that it's the intrinsic goods of sport that we ought to value, not the instrumental ones. So it shouldn't be just about winning a match at any cost or winning a race at any cost. However, as I said at the beginning, I recognise that there are different demands placed on athletes, especially if they feel that perhaps they're not performing at a particular level that they need to perform at, and therefore perhaps they get given an option to cheat in a particular way, whether it's through drug taking or whether it's through diving, because winning is so important to them. Now, I'm not saying they're right, and I don't think they're right. I think they're wrong on that. But we need to recognise the different demands placed on professional athletes. I do think. I think you're absolutely right saying that there is a problem from the athlete's perspective, but it's the same for any of us in any situations. If other people are cheating and get away with things, we feel really aggrieved with it. As humans, we're generally good cheat detectors, and if somebody cheats in an exam and gets away with it, we feel equally aggrieved. So, definitely agree with you in that respect. From a spectator's point of view, which I think is a lot of perspectives being put across here, there is the idea of, well, sport is just entertainment. We just want to be entertained and we want to enjoy the drama of it. And there is also that too. Now, that doesn't help the athlete, because the athlete who wants to ensure that they're achieving the best possible performance that they can and they, get the place that they deserve, and it is fair, but you have to weigh up the fact that people are interested in sport because they like to be entertained with it. So you've got loads of different kind of complexities all being involved there.
So, it is a really interesting point, and certainly I know certainly stories from football that absolutely kind of, Wales were on the point of qualifying for an international tournament. I think it was a European Championships, and they got to a playoff against Russia. Went and got a very, very creditable draw in Moscow, and turned up in Cardiff, and a lot of them were drugged up to their rivals. Absolutely eyes on stalks, do you know what I mean? And got away with it. Actually, 2 of the Russian players tested positive, but UEFA didn't see fit to chuck Russia out of the tournament. If it had been the other way around, you suspect they probably would have chucked Wales out. But I just wonder whether, I know what you mean about that moment of crossing the line, but just, for me, winning is part of sport. But that whole thing about, winning is everything, and I think that's to do with aphorisms, and that's to do with kind of, quotes, and I think, obviously you've competed at a much higher level than I've ever competed, but I just feel that, sport is about loving and respecting the game, whatever that game may be, and that yes, that gold medal that team that should have crossed the line first were denied that moment of crossing the line first, but everything that went up to that moment and everything that's happened since, because they've got that gold medal. I'm not saying it justifies it. I'm not saying that the Russians shouldn't be, you know, have their bloody canoe or whatever you call them, capsize and drown the buggers. Do you know what I mean? I'm not saying it's right, but I wouldn't say that. I'd be very, very upset if that British crew had been crippled emotionally by the fact that, you know, it is a part of sport, and the revelation of the rights and wrongs is also a part of sport. It's part of that process that Philippe was talking about, you know, bringing everything, good and bad. You can't just go, okay, well, in life we're like this, but in sport we're all going to be paragons. It just won't happen, you know.
I think also, you know, there is a constant battle between the rules and the technology and the sports people. That's what goes on. Particularly, we're talking almost entirely about professional sports, and many of what we were saying, by the way, really doesn't apply to the realm of amateur sport. I think it is rather a different perspective there. But we're talking about sport where we pay a lot of money. I don't know quite what a selfish spectator is, actually. Am I selfish because it costs me a lot of money to go to watch Chelsea? Well, I go, but I do therefore expect something back. I'm not quite sure what it would be. But, you know, diving, I genuinely don't like diving. It does piss me off, and I'm sure they will eventually bring in retrospective red cards for it, and then there'll be other ways that will be found of cheating, and I actually would be quite pleased if they did that. Not least because we're quite bad at it, actually, which some of the teams are much better. I'm intrigued by the moral dilemma, Ken, or the moral decadence of being both a Celtic supporter and a Greyhound. I didn't realise that it extended to that world, but there we are. It's another reason for glad I'm not supporting Celtic. But I mean, you know, there's a point under that though, which is about the gaining of advantage. Now, you know, we all, when we went to the Olympics last summer, you know, it was a wonderful occasion. We were all very pleased on Super Saturday when we won 3 gold medals. That was an article in the paper yesterday that I wasn't aware of this. It was Jess Joannis, who won perfectly fairly, there's no question about that. But she has 37 trainers. You know that she has 37 trainers. I don't believe anyone else on that day in that sport, let alone in athletics, has 37 trainers. Now that is clearly buying an advantage of some shape or form, which others are not able to do. Do we feel bad about that? I don't think we do, but nevertheless, advantage is being bought.
There's a question about going to ground easily and whether that's cheating and you know, what we think about it. Now, I think it's an interesting phenomenon because I think there's a kind of vexed moral debate about how this is becoming more common in British football and English football. And it's been, and Tom mentioned it earlier, there's a kind of unspoken chauvinism here. It's the foreigners who've brought this kind of disease of diving and feigning injury and holding up imaginary cards and so on. And it does clash, that kind of, you know, people, that's great. And obviously if it happens to you and you're on the football pitch, it's incredibly annoying if someone's gone down easily. But what's interesting, I've been rereading Gabriele Marcotti and Gianluca Violi's book, Italian book, which is about comparing English and Italian football. And they make the point that in Italy, going to ground, there's a completely different attitude to winning fouls or going to ground easily. It's seen as clever, you know, it's not seen as immoral. Diego Maradona's hand of God was seen as cunning, and there wasn't the same stigma attached to it. And what Violi and Marcotti say is that it's because in Latin American countries, in Italy and in South America, football is seen as a job. Gaining advantage is kind of part of the aims, the aims of winning. It's not seen as an instrument of moral education. There isn't the same obsession with teaching values. And actually, Violi points out that if the British spend a little bit more time teaching people skills rather than values, we'd have better football. I think it's a point well made.
No, it is a really interesting point. It almost makes you think that when it comes to diving, where we're actually talking about cheating exactly, that actually it's more kind of to do with custom, because you're absolutely right, you know. And it's been forever here too, you know. I'm old enough to remember Francis Lee, who, you know, I mean, was just spectacular.
Sent off, didn't he, for faults and all?
Yeah, he did, but you know, you will never see, I don't care who, you can run as many kind of tapes of contemporary players as you like, you will never see a player who dived for so many penalties and won them as Francis Lee, and what was a very successful Manchester City team. And it was also, you might know actually, because it's the enemy, but there was a Rangers centre forward in the kind of late 60s, early 70s, who Rangers fans themselves, he went to ground so easily, went down so easily that the Rangers fans actually nicknamed him Polaris. Just so it's always gone. I'm not sure. A lot of the stuff to do with diving, you know, did he, you know, what's sufficient contact? You know, has he bought that penalty? Has he earned that penalty? A lot of it is to do, I think, with custom, and you know, does vary from. I actually think that currently the obsession with diving is actually less a function of the game and changes in the game, and more a function of changes in the media. In that, I think that, you know, the vast majority of television coverage, you know, there's a huge proportion of television coverage, newspaper coverage, is about refereeing decisions. Because, with all due respect, you know, there are an increasing number of people who pronounce on football who haven't actually got the faintest idea what they're watching. But refereeing decisions, particularly if they're replayed over and over again, everybody can have an opinion on. Do you know what I mean? Did he touch him? Did he not touch him? Do you know what I mean? It's a very easy way to kind of fill the gaps between halves in televised football matches. Very easy way to open a paragraph in a match report is with a refereeing decision, because we can all get to grips with that, and it can be nice, either nice because it's black or white, or it can be nice because it's a little more nuanced. But whether it's such a big deal, I'm not sure. I think it's more to do with the way sport's covered in the media. Football specifically is covered in the media at the moment, rather than being quite a problem that it's cracked up to being actually out on the pitch.
Okay, I'll take another round. The lady, yeah, right at the back.
Good to speak now.
All right, you do it, and then the lady right at the back.
Well, I think the first thing I've got to say is it's fascinating that a Chelsea supporter can, if I can quote you, I think, question or feel affronted by the buying of an advantage. Just sort of Robbie's brain just is raised.
Thank you, Richard.
Anyway, I mean, I was brought up, I mean, some of the things I was going to say, funny enough, have just been touched on, but I was brought up obviously in the era where cheats never prosper. That's what my mum said, that's what she believed in. I'm not sure if she were alive today, she'd say the same thing. I'm not sure we've got any agreed understanding of what constitutes cheating, and perhaps this diving debate has highlighted it more. And what you touched on earlier, I mean, if a kid goes to eat, you know, lots of debates will be drawn into this. The kid goes to Eton and has all the facilities there and has a chance to do things. Is that cheating compared to a kid that lives in Newham that never even gets near a rugby pitch, for instance? Is a debating point. And then to some extent, to add to yours, Tom, because I was going to say, I mean, I've always been interested in the connection between the front and back pages of newspapers, and it's interested in 1774, which is being reminded of in Poland, when we didn't qualify. The back of the newspapers, after they'd gone on the clown business, were rarely, you know, what are the reasons for failure? And it was generally agreed that footballers were paid too much, they didn't have enough incentive. On the front of the newspaper on the same day, there was demand that Hoover workers should accept a 20% pay cut because of the recessionary times we lived in. And it's interesting to think that on the front of the newspapers now, I've just come from another debate where it's all about constant collapse in trust in everything, all institutions, you know, politicians, doctors, teachers, ourselves indeed, parents. And here we are, sort of a constant distrust in sports, because there's a constant sense that everybody's cheating. We watch Usain Bolt and we think, yeah, they haven't found a drug, you know, a test yet, sadly, or countless other things. And it's just, perhaps it just mirrors our times as much as anything else.
Okay, so right at the back, and then I'll take everybody else, but be quite quick. Okay.
I have a very quick one, because what Tom said earlier about a erosion of whatever trust we had in referees and linesmen, and not believing the evidence of our own eyes. The authority that referees and linesmen did have seems to have been replaced by the reliance on technology, and it does seem to have made a big difference. It seems to be creeping into, further into football, certainly. My second point was about Lance Armstrong. I don't think if he hadn't played the cancer card, he had cancer, but he marketed it very well indeed to the media and the press. And I think his tragedy was, thrown into greater relief because he really did play the victim card with cancer with most of his celebrity in that context, which I think is why he is seen as the dark side of the sport that always had that dark side. It just was like a hell of a more glamorous tragedy than it really was. And thirdly, probably controversially, now that we have very good and efficient drugs which sports people can obviously take to enhance their performance, why don't we just legitimise?
Okay. Right, well, yeah, a few hands. So, just, Rob, if you just, the lady at the end there, just go through it. People make quick points we come up the panel.
Yeah, I agree with what people said about individual cheating, but I think I'm more concerned about institutionalised cheating and the impact of things like match fixing and the betting companies on sport. That seems to be much more corrosive. If you listen to commentary on Talk Sport now, it's all about closing out bets, it's commentary on betting, and that seems to be much more problematic than individual cheating.
I'd like to stand up for the sport and morality of sport. I coach an under-10s team, and trying to put our first win today. But I think it's really important what we teach the kids. I mean, not for them, they just enjoy playing football, but for me as an adult, think about team play, fair play and all that. And the last thing that we can't stand is when kids blatantly cheat, when kids, got a kid going on goal and they get fouled, or kids diving. For me as an adult, with kids, I think the moral value, if you like, that is very important.
Okay, well, let's just say everybody got their hands up, and then we'll come back to the panel and see what we run out of time.
Just had a question about whether or not the panel thought that the penalties for cheating, specifically for individuals in athletics, is too great, because as you know, Accusations, who turned out not to have been cheating, and effectively she was accused in her crime, spent a couple of years in having various pointless investigations that turned out to whether or not she was a man, which I thought was very humiliating, very unfair, and she came back in the 2012 Olympics and completely lost her form. And I just wondered if you thought, even if someone has cheated, is it fair to effectively end their career right there and have no possibility of ever coming back because the process takes so long?
Okay, and the person down here.
I'm a sports science student, and we looked at a study last year by William Gold that evaluated something about a sample size of 100 elite sports athletes, and 95% of them would be willing to take a supplement that would eventually kill them if it guaranteed glory and success. I mean, that's where I think we should look at the underlying psychology of current elite athletes rather than saying, okay, cheating is part of the sport, it adds drama to it. If these elite athletes are willing to perhaps kill themselves to win, perhaps we should look at coaching, training, rather than, or perhaps the mentality of the athlete, rather than sort of the rest of it.
Okay, there's one guy behind you, and then we'll go to the side.
Hi. I've played football at quite a high level in the past, and cheating has certainly almost been part of the game, but I think one thing that's not been brought out of the discussion is that actually overall cheating, although it might help you in an individual instance, over time the best team always wins. So cheating has an effect. It's a very, very limited effect. It will not make up for the lack of skill, strength, commitment, and pace.
Okay. Right, let's move over the people down here with their hands, and then we'll come back.
The point was made about refereeing decisions distracting from, and therefore cheating distracting from sporting events. But surely in this debate you could take it a bit further to say that those acts of cheating go on to ruin games. I mean, you spoke about the Ghana semi-final, and I think that the the cheating in that game distracted from Ghana's entire performance in the tournament. The fact that Asamoah Gyan missed the penalty in the 120th minute, then scored one in the shootout, which took an incredible bottle. I mean, there were other games of the Pakistan spot fixing against England being 90 for 7, going on to score over 450 and win the game. The cheating might not ruin the sport in a wider context, but in terms of individual games, these matches are being ruined by a crowd of cheating.
I think absolutely though, sure. It's very interesting you talk about, we had someone talking here about institutional cheating, and to compare those two things I think is missing the point I was making about that quarter-final. You're absolutely right, but you know, what I'm saying is it was a human moment. That what Suarez did was a human moment, and it was, you know, I'm not saying, oh, so it's okay. You know, I felt the pain of that night like anybody else in that. You know, it was heartbreaking, because absolutely Ghana deserved to win that game, had lit up the tournament. You know, like I say, he cheated a continent, but it was a human moment. Spot fixing, it's not the same thing. It's institutional. I mean, I would say that perhaps, is cheating ruining sport? I'm not sure. I said at the start, I think if cheating was ruining sport, then it would have ruined it by now. Is organised corruption ruining sport? That's a question. And I think that increasingly, you know, obviously always the wealthiest have had an advantage. But increasingly I think there is a, you know, whether it's ironic that you mentioned the betting companies, and of course betting companies are the ones who stand most to lose from match fixing, even more than punters in many ways. But do you know what I mean? That there is a distinction between institutional and, I don't know what you call it, human cheating, you know. And the one is unbelievably dangerous. The other, as I say, it's not that it's right. In fact, quite the opposite. It's important that it gets fought against, condemned, talked about, but the idea that we can get by without it in sport is probably wishful thinking.
Okay, I'll just, okay, take this to, and then we'll...
Yeah, just a short question. So the governing bodies, the UCIs, FIFAs, how come they have been so poor in, I suppose, taking the case against cheats?
Okay.
Just to come back to Tom's point, it's a very spectator-centric view that we do sport because we love it. Spectators go and watch sport because they're not watching sport, but otherwise there's no real incentive to go and watch sport. But as an athlete, I certainly didn't get up at 4 o'clock on a February morning at -4 in the snow to go out training because I loved doing it, because it was horrible.
But you loved the sport enough to do it?
No, I did it because I wanted to better myself and because I knew everybody else that I was competing against was also doing it. And ultimately, as an athlete, we do sport because, for biological reasons, we get an adrenaline rush, we get endorphins from it, and that comes at its maximal point when you cross that line first, and you can't get that back to people.
Okay, well, I'll take the panel to make sort of final points and any responses to any of the questions being made. Let's go. Emily?
Yeah, I think I've changed my position slightly as we've gone through this debate, which is always good, because it means the debate has done its job. I think the point that you made about the fact that it does have an adverse effect on particular games or particular instances of sports. So I think if the question was, does cheating ruin sport? I think yes, it does in those particular instances, because it makes the game worse than it ought to be in its kind of perfect form. I think that you need to make a distinction between cheating as a kind of deliberate attempt to gain an advantage, whether that's institutionally through kind of gambling, or whether that's because you want to win a particular match or race that perhaps you don't deserve to win. But there's also the issues, the kind of the grayer areas of gamesmanship, where you're just kind of bending those rules to gain an advantage as well. And I think that's more problematic as to how it should be officiated. My concern really is is in the way that the instrumental values of sport are promoted, certainly at the top end, which is about winning, earning money, whether that's through illegal gambling or earning money through ensuring your contract is renewed for next year. And I do have a concern with that, because I think that we ought to want to play sport for the intrinsic goods of it. And that's not necessarily because you enjoy it or you have fun, but it's because, and exactly what you said, you want to better yourself. So it's not about the result, but it's about something intrinsic to sport itself. And finally, I'll just pick up the point about Caster Semenya. I think that's a slightly different issue. The way that the IAAF and the media treated that issue was absolute disgrace. Absolute disgrace. Semenya was not cheating, but it highlighted a problem with the way that sport is structured, in particular in this very binary categories between male and female. And I think that's a problem of sport, the way that it distinguishes between kind of men's sport and women's sport. So when it wants to so clearly, but I don't think, I think it's a slightly different issue in this debate.
Okay, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, well, two very quick points, but just to re-emphasise, Suarez's actions against Ghana didn't violate the fundamental rules of the sport. It was spotted, he was sent off, the ref did the right thing. It does not violate the whole principle of the football game, what he did. Match fixing does. Match fixing of cricket games does violate the whole rules and structure of that sport if that becomes widespread. I think I agree with you. I think that probably does do. But I just want to finish, I did actually do a tiny bit of research this very morning, and you can all practice this at home and you'll find it's true. If you put into Google, why is cheating wrong? Okay, you can do it now if you want to. And then you look at the third thing that comes up, because we can talk about sport, but of course cheating is wider. It takes you to a website for students that gives you practice essays, okay? And indeed, there is on that one a model essay, the answer to the question as to why cheating is wrong. It gives you all the answers as to why it is unfair and you don't deserve to succeed if you cheat. And if you just get the first paragraph, to get the whole essay, you have to be, it's a premium essay, and it's only available to upgraded members at a higher cost. And I just don't think the word irony quite actually grasps the sheer beauty of that entry, of the model answer to the question, why is cheating wrong? And I have to say, it's made not just my day, but my whole year to find that. And you can do it for yourself and you'll see it's true.
Tom?
Well, no, all very interesting. And I do think there is a distinction to be made. You're still not happy, are you? Because it's, no, what he was saying was, winning is everything. Winning is the point, is what you're saying, isn't it?
But between
And
within the rules. Yeah.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, if winning is everything, well then, surely we shouldn't, wake up in the morning surprised that some people will do anything in order to experience that feeling. And that's, that's a pretty kind of fundamental thing. But I do think there is a difference between what, I don't know why, but I'm just calling it human cheating, if you like, and institutionalised cheating. And it just goes back to the question that you asked but never got answered about FIFA. And, if ever there were gamekeepers turned poachers, sports governing bodies increasingly, because sport is arguably the most, not only is it the most kind of compelling, the most fascinating, along with that goes the fact that it's also the most sellable human activity on earth, arguably. There's one other I can think of, but we're not here to discuss that. But you know what I mean? It's so sellable that the governing bodies themselves will defend the sport's marketability before they'll defend the sport's integrity. And there, you've got a huge problem. FIFA's a problem, certainly more of a problem than Luis Suarez.
Sure.
Yeah. On the discussion about institutional cheating and corruption and betting syndicates who are kind of bribing everyone. I think even there's probably a distinction. I think spot fixing is different from match fixing. You know, I can't remember the name of the Pakistan cricketer. He's jailed for 2 years for bowling 2 no balls. It doesn't alter the outcome of the game. That seems to be completely disproportionate. But match fixing destroys the moral framework of the ethos of the game. You're not playing by the rules. And I think that is wrong within the context. It ruins the game. And if I was taking part in the game, it would ruin the game for me. It would ruin the game for people watching it, to know that one side has kind of bought their victory or defeat. But it doesn't follow, and I think that's the point I was making, it doesn't follow just because the game is ruined, that sport is ruined, or that society is ruined as a consequence, that the moral fabric is corroded. I think the problem is, and I think this is a very British problem, that we conflate all those things, and I think that it's possible to ruin a game without ruining sport or ruining society.
Thank you. Okay, can we thank our panel?